Elara Vance was a survivor. A waitress. A mother. A woman who'd clawed her way through life's hardest blows and finally found peace in a quiet little town. But something in Willow Creek had other plans. First came the collapse, then the nightmares. Pain. Hallucinations. Her husband and sons are falling sick one by one. Doctors were baffled. Neighbors whispered. And Elara felt it, this wasn't stress. It was a war. An invisible, targeted assault. By the time they uncovered the truth, it was almost too late, a rare, undetectable poison, laced into their lives by someone who lived just next door. This isn't just a story of illness. It's a story of obsession, arrogance, and a deadly game played by a genius who saw murder as art. So, keep your mind and let's start. The aroma of coffee and toasted rye usually comforted Elara Vance, a warm, familiar hug at the start of her shift. But not today. Today, the scent caught in her throat, thick and cloying, as a tremor ran through her, starting in her fingertips and racing up her arms like an icy premonition. Willow Creek, a town nestled by the whispering pines and famed for its crisp autumn air, prided itself on its tranquility. Main Street, with its quaint storefronts and the cheerful yellow awning of the Morning Glory Diner, was usually a picture of serene, small-town life. This morning, however, that tranquility was about to be shattered, at least for Elara. She stood mid-pivot, a carafe of steaming coffee in one hand, a friendly retort for old Mr. Henderson on her lips. Then it hit her. A brutal fist clenching her chest, stealing her breath. Her heart. It wasn't just beating, it was a trapped bird, frantic and wild against her ribs. Boom. 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 Louder, faster, until the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation in the Morning Glory faded into a distant roar. Her vision swam. The checkered linoleum floor seemed to tilt, the cheerful chatter of her regulars, voices she knew as well as her own, warping into an alien soundscape. Elara? You alright, hon? It was Martha, the diner's owner, her usually jovial face creased with concern. Elara tried to nod, to offer a reassuring smile, but her lips felt numb, her limbs heavy, unresponsive. The coffee pot slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor with a sound that seemed to rip through the sudden silence. Hot coffee splashed, the dark stain spreading like a creeping dread across the clean floor. Her legs, suddenly boneless, gave way. She wasn't falling so much as deflating. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This wasn't just a dizzy spell. This was something else. Something terrifying. The tingling, once a mere tremor, now buzzed with an aggressive intensity, her hands and feet feeling like they'd been plunged into electrified water. A chilling premonition, sharp as a shard of ice, pierced the fog in her brain. This is how it ends. But Elara Vance wasn't one to give up easily. Life hadn't been particularly kind, had it? A single mother to her bright, energetic son, Leo, she'd weathered storms that would have broken lesser women. A failed marriage that had left her picking up the pieces of her heart and her finances, years of juggling 2, sometimes 3, low-paying jobs just to keep their small boat afloat. She'd faced down repo men with a steely glare and patched up Leo's scraped knees with a tenderness that belied her own weariness. Resilience was etched into the lines round her kind eyes, woven into the fabric of her being. Willow Creek knew her as the woman who always had a smile, a word of encouragement, the one who remembered how everyone took their coffee and the names of all their grandkids. Strong. Capable. Unflappable Elara. This, though? This was different. This invisible assailant was something she couldn't reason with, couldn't work harder to overcome. As concerned faces swam above her, as hands reached out, she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if watching herself from a great distance. The mundane backdrop of the diner, the specials board with its neatly chalked lettering, the scent of bacon and maple syrup, the worn formica countertops, seemed suddenly, terribly fragile, a thin veneer over an abyss of unknown horror. This ordinary life, the one she'd fought so hard to build for herself and Leo, felt like it was about to be irrevocably shattered. Later, after the concerned fussing of her coworkers and the thankfully brief, though embarrassing, Attention of paramedics had subsided, Elara found herself at home, the incident dismissed as a severe panic attack or perhaps a vasovagal episode. Too much stress, not enough rest, Doc Abernathy had clucked, patting her hand. Easy for him to say. But the explanation felt flimsy, a paper-thin bandage over a gaping wound of unease. The physical sensations had mostly passed, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a lingering, metallic taste in her mouth. But the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. This wasn't just stress. This was an intrusion. An alien force that had, for a terrifying few minutes, hijacked her own body. As she lay on her worn couch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the familiar, comforting clutter of her small living room, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that this was not an isolated event. It was a warning. A whisper from a darker secret that Willow Creek, with its picturesque charm and friendly smiles, might be unknowingly harboring. What unseen force was at play here, in this town she had chosen for its very peacefulness? And was this strange, terrifying collapse the end of a chapter, or merely the ominous beginning of a story whose ending she couldn't yet dare to imagine? Little did she know, this was merely the overture to a symphony of suffering, a first, chilling note that would soon swell into a cacophony of fear and loss, unearthing the precarious foundations of the new life she so desperately clung to. The terror of that morning at the Morning Glory still clung to Elara Vance like a shroud, making her cherish the fragile piece of her new life even more fiercely, even as the ominous whispers of its vulnerability grew louder in her mind. To understand the precipice on which she now stood, one had to journey back, not far, but deep into the winding paths of a life that had already demanded so much resilience. Elara hadn't been born into sunshine and roses, far from it. Her childhood in a gritty, industrial town a world away from Willow Creek was a tapestry woven with threads of scarcity and the quiet ache of a mother who worked her fingers to the bone, yet always seemed to be chasing shadows. That early hardship didn't break her, it forged her. It instilled in her a fierce independence and a work ethic that could shame a draft horse. Her first marriage, to a man named Mark who had a smile as wide as the horizon and promises just as empty, had been a youthful miscalculation. He'd been charming, oh yes, a whirlwind of laughter and grand gestures that had swept a younger, more naive Elara off her feet. But the laughter faded, replaced by the slamming of doors and the bitter taste of disappointment. The grand gestures shriveled into careless neglect, then outright cruelty. When their son, Leo, was just a toddler, a miniature sunbeam in an increasingly bleak landscape, Elara had found the strength to walk away. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a single mother with a few crumpled dollars in her pocket and a heart full of jagged edges. But for Leo, she would have faced down dragons. And in many ways, she did. She worked grueling shifts at soulless jobs, her hands raw from cleaning solutions, her back aching from standing for endless hours. She learned to stretch $1 until Lincoln screamed, to conjure meals from almost nothing, all while ensuring Leo never felt the chill of their poverty, never doubted for a second that he was the center of her universe. He was her why, her anchor in the storm. Then came Reese Corbin. He'd walked into her life like a gentle breeze after a hurricane, a quiet man with kind eyes and a story of his own. He was a carpenter, his hands calloused but capable, his presence steadying. Reese, too, was navigating the choppy waters of single parenthood, raising his son, Sam, after a divorce that had left its own share of scars. Sam was a quiet, observant boy, a few years older than Leo, his initial shyness a mirror to Reese's own reserved nature. Their first meeting was at a Willow Creek fall festival, amidst the scent of cinnamon apples and the laughter of children. Elara, there with a boisterous Leo who was determined to win every carnival game, had literally bumped into Reese as he tried to coax a reluctant Sam onto the creaky Ferris wheel. Coffee was spilled, apologies were mumbled, and something unspoken, a recognition of shared experience perhaps, passed between them. Their courtship was slow, cautious. Two wounded birds, wary of taking flight again. They met for coffee, then dinner. The boys, Leo and Sam, eyed each other with the typical suspicion of children thrust together, a territorial dance that slowly, painstakingly, evolved into a grudging alliance, then a genuine, if sometimes boisterous, brotherhood. Leo's exuberance began to draw Sam out of his shell, while Sam's quiet thoughtfulness sometimes tempered Leo's wilder impulses. It was a start. Elara found herself drawn to Rhys's quiet strength, the way he listened without judgment, the gentle humor that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He, in turn, seemed captivated by her unwavering spirit, her fierce love for Leo, the laughter that, when it came, was as bright and infectious as a summer morning. The proposal wasn't grand, no bended knee or diamond ring she couldn't afford. It was a quiet question over a shared plate of spaghetti in Elara's tiny kitchen, the boys asleep in their rooms. Maybe we could build something together, Elara. All of us? His voice was hesitant, hopeful. And Elara, looking into his honest, earnest face, felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in years, hope. A fragile, tentative hope for a second chance at happiness, at family. They married a year later, a simple ceremony in the Willow Creek town park, under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. Leo and Sam, scrubbed and fidgeting in new shirts, stood beside them, an unlikely pair of groomsmen. Their new home was a modest, slightly ramshackle house on the edge of town, one that Rhys, with his carpenter's skills, promised to transform. And for a while, it felt like a dream. The house filled with the sounds of two growing boys, laughter, arguments, the thud of running feet. Elara found herself humming as she cooked, a lightness in her step she hadn't realized she'd lost. There were family dinners, sometimes chaotic, always loud. Movie nights with a shared bowl of popcorn. Tentative steps towards becoming a blended family. Real. But even in those early days of fragile happiness, there were undercurrents. Money was a constant, gnawing worry. Combining two households, two sets of financial obligations, on a waitress's tips and a carpenter's fluctuating income was a tightrope walk. Arguments, hushed and tense, would sometimes erupt late at night, after the boys were asleep, usually over bills or the unexpected repair the old house inevitably demanded. "We'll manage, Elara." "We always do," Rhys would say, his voice trying for reassurance, but sometimes she'd see a flicker of something else in his eyes, frustration? Or was it something deeper, a weariness that mirrored her own? Rhys himself remained something of an enigma. He was a good man, she believed that with all her heart. Kind to Leo, patient, hardworking. But there were parts of him he kept locked away, shadows from his past, his previous marriage, that he rarely spoke of. Sometimes, she'd catch a look on his face, a distant, haunted expression that made her wonder what demons he wrestled with in the quiet hours. He could be incredibly tender one moment, then retreat into a moody silence the next, a shift that left Elara feeling unsettled, walking on eggshells. Was this the steadfast partner she longed for, or was his charming exterior a carefully constructed facade, hiding complexities she hadn't yet fathomed? These unspoken anxieties, these subtle hints of underlying tension, were like hairline cracks in the foundation of their new life, invisible to the casual observer, but felt, deeply, by Elara. The stakes of this newfound happiness were immense. It was everything she'd ever yearned for, a safe harbor for herself and her son. And the thought of it all crumbling, of this second chance being snatched away, was a constant, low hum of fear beneath the surface of her days. For a fleeting season, it seemed happiness had finally taken root in Elara's life, a fragile bloom in the often harsh terrain of her existence. A season, however, that was about to be cruelly, inexplicably, and terrifyingly cut short, as the whispers of the future began to gather into a storm that threatened to sweep everything away. The reprieve was short-lived, a cruel mirage before the desert of suffering stretched endlessly before them. It started again, not as a whisper this time, but as a roar, the unseen affliction clawing its way back into Elara Vance's life with a vengeance that stole her breath and chilled her to the bone. The initial episode at the diner, terrifying as it had been, paled in comparison to the relentless siege that now began. The tingling in her limbs returned, no longer a mere buzzing but a sensation akin to thousands of angry needles stabbing her from within. Her heart, that frantic bird, resumed its panicked flutter, often accompanied by a crushing weight on her chest that made each breath a conscious, agonizing effort. Sleep offered no escape. It was a landscape of vivid, tormenting nightmares from which she'd awakened drenched in a cold sweat, her body thrumming with an unholy energy. Her fear, a constant companion now, was a corrosive acid eating away at her resolve. Confusion clouded her thoughts, making simple tasks monumental. She'd forget words mid-sentence, stare blankly at familiar objects, the world around her taking on a distorted, dreamlike quality. But it was the physical agony that truly tested the limits of her endurance. Waves of nausea would leave her weak and trembling. A searing pain, like liquid fire, would course through her arms and legs, leaving her gasping, tears streaming down her face. There were days she couldn't leave her bed, the slightest movement in excruciating torment. Rhys Corbin watched his wife's decline with a maelstrom of emotions churning within him. His initial concern, tender and solicitous, began to fray under the relentless strain. He was a practical man, a carpenter who understood the logic of wood and nail, of problem and solution. This invisible enemy that defied diagnosis, that turned his vibrant, resilient Elara into a shadow of her former self, was beyond his comprehension. Helplessness gnawed at him, a bitter pill for a man used to fixing things with his own two hands. He drove her to countless doctor's appointments, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, listening to the same vague pronouncements, the same frustrating lack of answers. It could be chronic fatigue, one specialist mused. Perhaps a rare neurological disorder, another suggested, his tone lacking any real conviction. Fibromyalgia. Lyme disease. Early onset MS. The labels changed, but the suffering remained, a constant, mocking presence in their home. And with the helplessness came frustration, an ugly, unwelcome guest. Sometimes, late at night, when Elara's moans of pain echoed through the thin walls of their small Willow Creek house, Rhys would find himself pacing the kitchen, a tightness in his own chest. Was she exaggerating? Could it really be this bad? The unworthy thoughts would flicker, quickly extinguished by guilt, but they left their stain. He'd snap at her sometimes, his voice sharper than he intended, over some small, inconsequential thing. "Elara, you have to try harder," he'd said once, during a particularly bleak week, the words tasting like ash in his mouth even as he uttered them. He saw the wounded look in her eyes, the way she shrank from his impatience, and the guilt would redouble, a vicious cycle of his own making. He loved her, desperately. But this constant, draining battle was taking its toll on him, on them. The easy laughter they had once shared became a distant memory, replaced by a heavy, anxious silence. The children, Leo and Sam, were unwilling witnesses to this slow-motion disintegration of their family life. Leo, usually a whirlwind of boundless energy, became quiet, his young face etched with a worry far beyond his years. He'd sit by Elara's bedside for hours, stroking her hand, his bright eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "Mommy, when will you be better?" he'd ask, his small voice trembling, and Elara would have to fight back her own tears to offer a weak, unconvincing reassurance. Sam, older and more introverted, retreated further into himself. He'd hover in doorways, his gaze fixed on Elara, a silent, anxious sentinel. The once boisterous household fell under a pall of sickness and uncertainty. Then, the nightmare deepened. It started with Sam complaining of a persistent queasiness, a strange fizzy feeling in his legs. Rhys, already stretched to his limit, initially dismissed it as sympathy pains or a childhood bug. But when Sam, normally a stoic boy, began to cry out from cramps that twisted his small frame, Rhys felt a cold dread seep into his soul. Soon after, Leo, too, started to falter. His boundless energy evaporated, replaced by a lethargy that was utterly alien to his nature. He'd pick at his food, his face pale, complaining of a racing heart and a strange, prickling sensation in his feet, eerily similar to what Elara had first described. The parallel was horrifying, undeniable. Whatever unseen affliction had gripped Elara was now extending its tendrils towards their children. The desperate search for answers intensified, becoming a frantic, all-consuming quest. Doctors' offices became their second home. They traveled to specialists in neighboring towns, then to a renowned clinic in the city, each visit a new flicker of hope followed by the crushing weight of another dead end. The medical bills piled up, an avalanche of debt threatening to bury them. Rhys took on extra carpentry jobs, working until his body ached, the scent of sawdust and sweat a constant reminder of their mounting desperation. Elara, when she had the strength, would pore over medical journals in the local library, her eyes scanning pages of arcane text, searching for a clue, a name, anything that might explain the hell their lives had become. But the medical mystery remained stubbornly, cruelly, unsolved. The isolation was perhaps the hardest to bear. Friends and neighbors in Willow Creek, initially sympathetic, began to drift away, uncomfortable in the face of such persistent, unexplained suffering. Their well-meaning advice, "Have you tried yoga, dear, or maybe it's all in your head?" felt like tiny, stinging barbs. The family drew inwards, their small house becoming a fortress against a world that no longer understood, that couldn't see the invisible enemy waging war within its walls. Despair became a permanent resident, its cold breath fogging the windows, its heavy silence filling the spaces once occupied by laughter and hope. Elara, Reese, Leo, and Sam, they were trapped, caught in a claustrophobic nightmare with no discernible beginning and, it seemed, no foreseeable end. The question was no longer if they would find an answer, but whether they would survive long enough to hear it, or if the unseen affliction would simply consume them all, one by one, in the deepening shadows of their Willow Creek home. Just when the darkness seemed absolute, a faint, almost imperceptible light appeared at the edge of their nightmare. A referral to a new kind of doctor, a specialist in a field they hadn't even known existed, offered a final, desperate hope. In the sterile, hushed corridors of Willow Creek Memorial Hospital, under the scrutinizing, almost unnervingly intense gaze of Dr. Alistair Finch, the Vance Corbin family's ordeal entered a new, terrifying chapter. Dr. Finch was not like the other physicians they'd encountered on their Via Dolorosa of consultations and misdiagnoses. He was a neurologist, but with a reputation that tiptoed into the esoteric realms of toxicology and environmental medicine. Gaunt, with a shock of unruly silver hair that seemed to defy gravity and eyes that missed nothing, he listened to Reese's desperate, fragmented account of Elara's decline and the boy's subsequent illnesses with a stillness that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. Instead, he asked questions. Incisive, peculiar questions that delved into the minutiae of their lives, their diet, the water source at their old farmhouse, the pesticides used on neighboring farms, any unusual smells or tastes, even the hobbies of people they knew. Odd. Dr. Finch pored over the mountain of medical records Reese had lugged in, his long fingers tracing lines of inconclusive tests, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hours passed. He ordered a new battery of tests, some so specialized they had to send samples to a lab halfway across the country. He spoke of patterns, of symptom clusters that pointed away from common ailments and towards something more insidious, more external. The human body is a resilient machine, Mr. Corbin, Dr. Finch had said, his voice a low rumble, but even the strongest machine can be brought down by a sufficiently potent saboteur, especially one it doesn't recognize. He'd paused, his gaze locking with Reese's. "I suspect we are not dealing with a betrayal from within, but an attack from without." The name Umbracite was unknown to them, a whisper from the darkest corners of toxicology that Dr. Finch eventually, cautiously, introduced. He explained it was a heavy metal compound, exceedingly rare, fiendishly difficult to detect without specific testing protocols. Odorless. Tasteless. Its effects were devastatingly systemic, mimicking a host of neurological and autoimmune disorders, a ghost in the medical machine. The symptoms Elara and the boys exhibited, the relentless neuropathic pain, the cardiac irregularities, the gastrointestinal distress, in a new, horrifying development in Elara's case, the alarming loss of her once thick hair, all aligned with the grim profile of Umbracite poisoning. It was a possibility so remote, so outlandish, that no other doctor had even considered it. Why would they? Umbracite was the stuff of Cold War spy novels, not the quiet life of Willow Creek. The days that followed were a blur of agonizing suspense. Elara, now skeletal, her skin a translucent, papery gray, drifted in and out of consciousness in her hospital bed. Leo and Sam, in a nearby pediatric ward, were listless, their small bodies racked with pain and confusion. Reese lived in the sterile limbo of the hospital, shuttling between his fading wife and his suffering sons, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate, flickering ember of hope fanned by Dr. Finch's quiet intensity. He'd hold Elara's hand, her fingers bird-like and cold in his, and whisper stories of their early days, of Leo's first steps, of dreams they'd once shared for their blended family, his voice cracking, the words a useless bomb against the relentless tide of her deterioration. Then the call came. Dr. Finch summoned Reese to his small, cluttered office. The results were back. Reese felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, a sick echo of Elara's affliction. The doctor's face was grim, the usual clinical detachment replaced by a somber compassion that was almost harder to bear. "The levels are astronomical," Reese, Finch said, the use of his first name a small, stark signal of the gravity to come. "Elara, the concentration of Umbracite in her system is unlike anything I've ever encountered. Frankly, it's a miracle she's held on this long." He gestured to another set of figures. The boys. Leo and Sam, also significantly elevated. Not as high as Elara, but well into the critically toxic range. The words hit Reese like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Umbracite. A name for their tormentor. But the name brought no relief, only a new, colder wave of horror. This wasn't some random, cruel twist of fate, some inexplicable medical anomaly. This was an act. Deliberate. Malicious. Someone had done this to them. The realization was a sliver of ice in his gut, spreading its chill through his entire being. Dr. Finch explained there was an antidote, a chelating agent that could, theoretically, bind to the Umbracite and help flush it from the system. But for Elara, he shook his head, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "For Elara, I fear it's too late. The damage is too extensive, too profound. We can try, of course. We will try. But you need to prepare yourself." For Elara, the fight was indeed nearing its end. The poison had ravaged her body beyond repair. There were moments of lucidity, brief, heartbreaking flashes where her eyes would clear, and she would look at Reese, at Leo and Sam when they were wheeled in to see her, the universe of love and sorrow in her gaze. She couldn't speak much, her voice a mere whisper, but her touch, though weak, conveyed everything. She mouthed "I love you" to Reese, a single tear tracing a path down her gaunt cheek. She tried to smile for the boys, to tell them to be strong, to look after each other. Those moments were treasures, hoarded by Reese against the encroaching darkness. Then, one quiet afternoon, with Reese holding her hand and the strains of a distant hospital chaplain's hymn drifting through the open door, Elara Vance, the resilient waitress, the devoted mother, the woman who had fought so hard for her fragile happiness, slipped away. The silence she left behind was a deafening roar of profound grief, a void that Reese knew would never truly be filled. The battle for Leo and Sam was a different kind of hell. The chelation therapy was brutal, a series of painful infusions that left them weak, nauseous, and terrified. Leo, ever the fighter, endured it with a grim determination that belied his tender years, his small hand gripping Reese's with surprising strength. Sam, quieter, more fragile, seemed to shrink further into himself, his large, expressive eyes filled with a silent, uncomprehending pain. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, agonizingly, the Umbracite levels in their small bodies began to recede. Leo, with the irrepressible spirit that was so much like his mother's, started to show signs of recovery first. A flicker of his old energy, a tentative smile, a whispered joke. Sam's journey was harder. The poison had taken a greater toll on his developing nervous system. He would recover, the doctors said, but there would be lingering effects. He would walk again, but always with a limp, a permanent, physical reminder of the shadow that had fallen over their lives. As his son slowly mended, a new, cold resolve began to harden within Reese Corbin. The grief for Elara was a raw, open wound, but it was now overlaid with a burning, icy rage. This was no accident. This was murder. Someone, somewhere in the quiet, unassuming town of Willow Creek, had deliberately, methodically, poisoned his family. Someone had looked at Elara, at his innocent sons, and had chosen to inflict this unimaginable suffering. The medical diagnosis had closed one chapter of their nightmare, only to open another, even darker one. Who could harbor such venom, such calculated malice? And why? The questions echoed in the hollows of Rhys's heart, a chilling refrain that promised no peace until answered. Grief was a suffocating blanket, but beneath it, a new, cold ember began to glow, the hunt for a monster hiding in plain sight. While one family grieved in the sterile quiet of Willow Creek Memorial, their world shattered by a diagnosis that named the monster but not its face, another family, merely a stone's throw away, lived cocooned in a world of meticulous order and chilling detachment. The answer to Rhys Corbin's anguished, burning question, who? Why? Might well reside behind the perfectly aligned, drawn blinds of the house next door, the residence of Silas Blackwood and his wife, Dr. Evelyn Thorne. Silas Blackwood was a man who seemed crafted from shadows and sharp edges. Tall and unnaturally thin, he moved with a kind of precise, economical gait, as if conserving energy for the complex machinations of his mind. His features were angular, dominated by intelligent, pale gray eyes that rarely seemed to blink and observe the world with a disconcerting lack of warmth. An aura of intellectual arrogance clung to him like expensive, slightly stale cologne. He was rarely seen engaging with the cheerful, often messy, life of Willow Creek. His lawn was immaculate, his hedges trimmed to geometric perfection, his house a silent sentinel overlooking the street. He worked from home, something involving complex algorithms and data streams that remained nebulous to his neighbors, emerging only for solitary, brisk walks at dawn or dusk, his gaze fixed ahead, acknowledging no one. He was, in the parlance of the town gossip mill, an odd duck, a bit of a recluse, probably brilliant, but definitely weird. His wife, Dr. Evelyn Thorne, was his polar opposite, at least superficially. A successful orthopedic surgeon with a thriving practice downtown, Evelyn was polished, articulate, and moved through Willow Creek's social strata with practiced ease. She served on hospital boards, attended charity luncheons, her composure impeccable, her professional smile rarely wavering. How she tolerated, let alone cohabited with, the eccentric and aloof Silas was a subject of much local speculation. Did she manage him, smoothing over his social awkwardness? Did she secretly enable his reclusiveness, benefiting from the reflected glow of his supposed genius? Or was there something else, a more complex dynamic hidden behind the pristine facade of their expensive home? Occasionally, Evelyn would offer vague excuses for her husband's absence at community events. Silas is deeply engrossed in a project, you know how he gets, delivered with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a tension there, a carefully maintained distance even when they were seen together, a sense that they orbited each other rather than truly connected. Their disdain for the Vance Corbin family next door wasn't overt, not initially. It manifested in subtle ways, perceptible mainly to Elara, whose sensitivity had been honed by years of navigating life's rougher edges. It was in the slight tightening of Silas's lips when Leo's laughter carried over the fence, the almost imperceptible way Dr. Thorne's gaze would slide past Elara at the grocery store, offering the barest minimum of polite recognition. Once, there had been a more direct confrontation. Rhys had been fixing a loose section of fence bordering their properties, the rhythmic thud of his hammer echoing in the quiet afternoon. Silas had appeared suddenly, silently, at the edge of his perfect lawn. "Must you make such a racket, Corbin?" His voice was quiet, devoid of inflection, yet laced with a chilling contempt. Some of us require a certain degree of tranquility for concentration. Rhys, taken aback, had mumbled an apology, but Silas had simply stared for a moment, his pale eyes cataloging Rhys's work boots, his sawdust-covered jeans, before turning and retreating back into his silent house, leaving Rhys feeling strangely diminished, judged. The noise, the cheerful chaos, the very ordinariness of the blended family next door seemed to grate on Silas Blackwood's highly refined sensibilities, an unwelcome intrusion into his meticulously controlled world. An affront. Silas's true intellectual outlet, his escape from the perceived mediocrity of Willow Creek, lay within the hallowed, albeit virtual and occasionally physical, halls of the Cerberus Society. It wasn't a local club, It was a highly exclusive, international organization for individuals whose IQ scores placed them in the stratosphere, the top fraction of a percentile. Membership was a badge of honor, a validation of innate superiority. The society fostered intellectual discourse, complex problem-solving, and, for some chapters like the one Silas belonged to, elaborate, immersive weekend retreats known as Enigma Weekends. These were not your average board games. They were intricately plotted, multi-layered murder mysteries, often set in secluded inns or remote lodges, where members assumed detailed personas, followed complex clues, and engaged in intense intellectual combat to unmask the killer amongst them. It was a rigorous mental exercise, a chance to flex cognitive muscles, but more than that, for Silas, it was a validation. A world where intellect reigned supreme, where the messy, illogical emotions of everyday life were replaced by pure, cold logic. A game he could control. A game he could win. And Silas Blackwood was currently designing the next Enigma weekend. He sat now in his study, a room as ordered and sterile as an operating theater. Books lined the walls, arranged not by author or subject, but by a complex system of his own devising. His desk was clear save for a high-end computer, a single notepad, and a precisely sharpened pencil. On the screen glowed complex diagrams, character matrices, and pages of meticulously crafted narrative. His current obsession, the method of murder. He discarded blunt force, too crude, firearms, too obvious, even common poisons, too easily detected. No, this required elegance. Finesse. A method that would truly test the vaunted intellects of his Cerberus peers. His pale eyes gleamed with a detached, almost predatory, intensity as he scrolled through obscure toxicological databases he'd accessed through less than official channels. Then, he found it. A footnote in an archaic text, detailing the properties of a rare, heavy metal compound. Umbracite. Perfect. Difficult to synthesize, yes, but not impossible for a mind like his, with his background in specialized chemistry. Its symptoms were insidious, mimicking other illnesses, delaying diagnosis. Its detection required specific, rarely employed tests. It was, in a word, elegant. The perfect weapon for the perfect intellectual puzzle. He began to sketch out the delivery mechanism, the scenario. A seemingly innocuous medium. Something commonplace, easily overlooked. Perhaps, beverages. A shared household item contaminated. Yes. He smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. The intellectual thrill of the puzzle was intoxicating. He envisioned his peers, the supposed best and brightest, stumbling, misdirected, frustrated by the sheer cleverness of his design. He wasn't thinking of blood or pain or grief. He was thinking of variables, of logical pathways, of the satisfying click of a complex mechanism falling into place. The victim in his scenario was merely a pawn, the investigators simply opponents in his game. He meticulously calculated potential dosages, absorption rates, the masking of taste. It was absorbing. Fascinating. A purely intellectual exercise divorced from any messy human reality. He titled the scenario, with a private, chilling amusement only he could appreciate, The Neighborly Complaint. A masterpiece of logic and, though he wouldn't use the word, malice, born from irritation and fueled by profound intellectual arrogance. His game was ready. A masterpiece of intellect and insidious design. And as Silas Blackwood leaned back, savoring the cold satisfaction of his creation, he remained blissfully unaware that miles away, in a hospital lab, the very real name Umbracite was being spoken aloud, a chilling echo reaching the ears of Willow Creek law enforcement. The board was set for a different game entirely, one whose rules Silas hadn't written, and whose stakes were infinitely, terrifyingly real. The hunt for the monster had, unknowingly, found its first real clue. His game was ready. A masterpiece of intellect and malice. And as Silas Blackwood leaned back, savoring the cold satisfaction of his creation, The Neighborly Complaint, he remained blissfully unaware that miles away, the very real name of his chosen poison, Umbracite, was finally giving the floundering police investigation a desperately needed jolt. The board was set for a different game entirely, one whose rules Silas hadn't written, and whose stakes were infinitely, terrifyingly real. Detective Frank Harding scrubbed a weary hand over his face, the fluorescent lights of the Willow Creek police station casting harsh shadows under his eyes. Coffee, stale and lukewarm, sat untouched on his cluttered desk. The Umbracite poisoning case was a nightmare. One dead mother, two traumatized, physically scarred children, a grieving husband, and absolutely zero viable leads. Reese Corbin, the husband, was clearly devastated, not calculating. The initial flurry of activity had yielded nothing. No disgruntled former employees with access to exotic toxins, no jilted lovers with a chemistry degree, no obvious enemies of the blue-collar Vance Corbin family. Just nothing. The case files mocked him, stacks of negative lab reports, dead-end interviews, vague timelines. And now, confirmation from Dr. Finch at the memorial, deliberate poisoning with something most chemists had only read about. Umbracite. Where the hell did someone in Willow Creek get Umbracite? Frustrated, Harding started again from the beginning, sifting through the initial reports, the interviews conducted months ago when Elara Vance first fell ill. His eyes snagged on a note mentioning Reese Corbin's vague recollection of a threat. A typed note, received weeks before the first symptoms. Harding had dismissed it at the time, along with Reese himself. Teenage prank, maybe? Misdelivered mail? Now, reading the transcribed text again, a chill traced its way down his spine. Your presence disturbs the equilibrium. Remove yourselves from Willow Creek within 14 days, or face definitive consequences. Definitive consequences. Precise. Cold. It didn't sound like a teenager. It sounded calculated. Harding pulled up the property records for the Vance Corbin house. He stared at the map, his gaze drifting, inevitably, to the house next door. Silas Blackwood and Dr. Evelyn Thorne. The town's resident enigma and his polished surgeon wife. Harding knew them by reputation, of course. Thorne was respected, if a bit aloof. Blackwood? A ghost. High IQ, supposedly. Kept to himself. Harding recalled Reese Corbin mentioning some friction, noise complaints, maybe a curt word exchanged over the fence line. Minor stuff, usually. But now... proximity. Reclusiveness. And that cold, precise note. Harding made a call, requested a background check on Blackwood. What came back wasn't criminal, not exactly, but it was interesting. No jail time, but whispers and academic records of pushing boundaries in a university chemistry program years ago, dabbling in unauthorized synthesis experiments before quietly withdrawing. Nothing concrete, but suggestive. And Dr. Finch had emphasized just how specialized the knowledge needed to acquire or create Umbracite would be. It required more than just access, it required a certain type of mind. A meticulous, patient, perhaps arrogant mind. Someone like Silas Blackwood? It was circumstantial. Thin. But it was the only thread he had. Getting inside Blackwood's world, though? That was the problem. The man was a fortress of intellect and isolation. Harding couldn't just knock on his door and expect answers. He needed subtlety. He needed someone Blackwood wouldn't see coming. With a sigh, Harding picked up the phone and made a call he hated making, requesting resources from the state's Bureau of Investigation, specifically their undercover unit. Explaining the situation felt like admitting defeat, bringing outsiders into Willow Creek's tragedy. But Elara Vance and her boys deserved justice, and Harding knew his standard methods wouldn't cut it here. Days later, she arrived. Not the grizzled veteran Harding had half expected, but a woman named Raven Sterling who looked sharp, analytical, and moved with a quiet confidence that belied her apparent youth. She listened intently as Harding laid out the case, the victims, the timeline, the baffling poison, the neighbors, the threat note, the frustrating lack of evidence. Her dark eyes absorbed everything, missing nothing. Blackwood's vulnerability is his ego, Raven stated simply after reviewing the files in Harding's preliminary profile. His intellect. He prides himself on being superior, detached. He likely craves validation from perceived peers. That's our way in. The plan was audacious, risky. Raven would become Serafina Sarah Du Bois. The cover, a visiting academic, perhaps an obscure historian or philosopher, seeking the quiet of Willow Creek to complete a research project. Sarah would be intelligent, sophisticated, maybe slightly eccentric herself, enough to intrigue Blackwood, not intimidate him. Crucially, she needed an entry point into his rarefied social circle, however small. The Cerberus Society. Raven spent days meticulously crafting Sarah's identity, forging credentials, creating an online footprint, acquiring a wardrobe that spoke of quiet intellectualism, and immersing herself in obscure philosophical theories and complex scientific concepts she knew Blackwood favored. It was method acting at the highest level, the stakes impossibly high. Her first move was targeting Dr. Evelyn Thorne. Sarah coincidentally attended a hospital fundraiser where Evelyn was a key speaker. During the mingling afterwards, Sarah approached Evelyn, not fawningly, but with an air of quiet respect, complimenting her work and engaging her in a brief but impressively knowledgeable conversation about advanced surgical techniques gleaned from rapid, intensive research. Evelyn, accustomed to either deference or professional rivalry, seemed intrigued by this articulate, unassuming newcomer. When Sarah mentioned her fabricated research in her recent move to Willow Creek for solitude, Evelyn, perhaps seeing a potential social ally or simply performing her civic duty, mentioned the Cerberus Society. "My husband, Silas, is deeply involved," she'd said, a familiar tightness around her smile. "They have fascinating discussions. Perhaps you'd find it stimulating?" An invitation, tentative but offered. Sarah accepted gracefully. Bingo! The first meeting with Silas Blackwood took place at their home, invited for sherry by Evelyn. Sarah played her part to perfection. She let Silas dominate the conversation, guiding it towards his intellectual interests with carefully placed questions. She listened, rapt, as he expounded on complex theories, offering insightful comments that showed she wasn't merely humoring him, but genuinely engaging. She mentioned, almost as an aside, her fascination with complex systems and game theory, how she'd heard whispers of the Society's legendary Enigma weekends. Silas's pale eyes flickered with interest. He was wary, yes, but undeniably flattered by this intelligent woman who seemed to genuinely appreciate the intricacies of his mind. He even offered a rare, thin smile. Sarah began attending local, often virtual, Cerberus Society gatherings, carefully navigating the intellectual egos, always positioning herself as an admirer of Silas's contributions. She learned about his latest project, the design for the upcoming Enigma weekend. "Poisoning!" she exclaimed, perhaps over a video call, arranging her features into an expression of fascinated admiration. "How wonderfully complex, Silas. The possibilities for misdirection, the psychological games. It sounds utterly brilliant. What kind of, scenario did you devise?" She held her breath, walking the razor's edge between genuine intellectual curiosity and suspicious probing. Silas, preening under the attention, launched into a detailed, albeit hypothetical, explanation of his perfect untraceable poison scenario, boasting about its elegance, its near impossibility to solve. Sarah listened, absorbing every detail, every nuance, her mind racing, connecting the dots between his macabre game and the real-life tragedy next door. The tension was palpable, a single misstep, a question too pointed, and the entire operation could collapse. Silas seemed utterly captivated by his own brilliance, reflected in Sarah's admiring gaze. He began inviting her over more often, for chess, for discussions. He trusted her. And as he complained one evening about needing absolute quiet to finalize some complex calculations for his work, perhaps even mentioning a short trip he and Evelyn were planning to take, Sarah saw it. The opening. The critical opportunity she and Harding had been waiting for. The Raven's gambit was entering its final, most dangerous phase. The key turned in the lock, not just opening a door, but potentially unlocking the chilling secrets hidden within Silas Blackwood's meticulously ordered world. Agent Raven Sterling, still outwardly the composed academic Serafina Du Bois, stepped inside, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her with an unnerving finality. She watched from the pristine living room window as Silas Blackwood expertly maneuvered his expensive sedan out of the driveway, Dr. Evelyn Thorne coolly adjusting her silk scarf in the passenger seat beside him. They were off for their weekend conference, leaving Sarah, the trusted, intellectually stimulating house sitter, in charge. The moment the car disappeared around the corner, the Sarah persona dissolved. Raven pulled a secure satellite phone from her bag, her movements swift and precise. "Harding," she spoke softly, her voice devoid of the warmth she'd so carefully cultivated for weeks. "They're gone. We're clear." Within minutes, unmarked cars converged silently on the quiet Willow Creek street. Detective Harding emerged, his face grimly determined, followed by a small, hand-picked team, forensic specialists, tech experts, seasoned investigators chosen for their discretion and skill. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just quiet professionals moving with practiced efficiency. Raven met them at the door, briefing them quickly on the layout, on Silas's known habits, on the areas she suspected might hold answers, particularly his off-limits study and the detached garage workshop he'd been inexplicably protective of. The air inside the house, thick with the scent of lemon oil and old books, crackled with a tense, focused energy. The unmasking of Silas Blackwood had begun. The search was methodical, painstaking. The main living areas, curated like museum exhibits with minimalist furniture and abstract art, yielded nothing beyond confirming the owner's fastidious nature and considerable wealth. Every surface gleamed, not a cushion was out of place. It felt less like a home, more like a statement. Impersonal. Cold. Then they moved to Silas's study. Here, the mask of impersonal taste slipped slightly. Bookshelves crammed with texts on advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, philosophy, and, ominously, toxicology and chemistry lined the walls. His desk remained clear, but the computer required the team's tech expert, who worked diligently to bypass the complex security protocols Silas had undoubtedly erected. While the tech worked, the rest of the team focused on the garage. It was detached, set back from the house, and initially seemed unremarkable. Garden tools hung neatly on pegs, shelves stocked with motor oil and cleaning supplies. But Raven pointed towards a reinforced, padlocked door at the back. "He told me it was just storage," she murmured to Harding. "But he was insistent I shouldn't go near it. Said the wiring was faulty." Harding nodded, bolt cutters making short work of the lock. Behind the door wasn't storage. It was a laboratory. Not the bubbling beakers of a mad scientist, but something far more chilling in its precision. Stainless steel counters, sophisticated ventilation hoods, glassware gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. A high-performance liquid chromatograph sat on one bench, distillation apparatus on another. And chemicals. Rows upon rows of labeled bottles containing compounds Harding didn't recognize, but which sent a jolt through the forensic chemist accompanying them. This wasn't a hobbyist setup, this was professional grade, capable of complex synthesis. The critical evidence wasn't immediately obvious. They bagged samples, documented equipment serial numbers, dusted for prints. Then, in a locked cabinet beneath a fume hood, they found it. A small, heavy glass vial containing a crystalline powder, labeled only with a complex alphanumeric code. Beside it, meticulously organized notebooks. Harding watched as the chemist carefully opened one. Pages filled with dense equations, molecular diagrams, and notes written in Silas's precise, spidery hand. Observations on reaction yields, purification methods, and chillingly detailed notes on physiological effects, cross-referenced with what looked disturbingly like entries from Elara Vance's stolen medical files, presumably obtained through Evelyn's access. Dates lined up ominously with the onset and escalation of the family's symptoms. Then, the chemist drew a sharp breath, pointing to a specific page detailing experiments involving Sparkle Fizz Cola. Notes on dissolving the synthesized compound, its lack of taste, its stability in the sugary liquid. Dosages calculated with terrifying precision. And tucked away on a lower shelf, almost overlooked, was a small bin containing several empty Sparkle Fizz Cola bottles, their caps showing microscopic signs of having been removed and resealed. A field test kit, rushed from the state lab, confirmed the powder in the vial and the faint residue in the cola bottles contained traces consistent with Umbracite. The final piece clicked into place. Silas hadn't just played a game, he'd meticulously documented his real-life atrocity. The team worked against the clock, photographing, bagging, sealing evidence. Just as they finished, word came via Raven's secure comms: the Blackwoods car had been spotted entering Willow Creek. Harding positioned his team discreetly. Silas and Evelyn pulled into the driveway, Silas emerging first, stretching slightly, looking almost pleased with himself after his intellectual retreat. Evelyn followed, her expression unreadable. Harding stepped forward, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Silas Blackwood? You're under arrest for the murder of Elara Vance and the attempted murder of Leo Vance and Samuel Corbin." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her composure finally cracking. Silas, however, barely reacted. He simply turned his head slowly, his pale eyes fixing on Harding with an expression of mild curiosity, as if observing an unexpected insect. There was no shock, no denial. Only a flicker of something akin to intellectual disappointment. "Umbracite," he stated, his voice flat. "Crude, detective. But I suppose effective enough for your purposes. Did Serafina assist you in this deductive leap?" He glanced towards Raven, who stood impassively nearby, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. His arrogance was absolute, impenetrable. He showed no remorse, only a chilling disdain for being caught by minds he clearly considered inferior. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his thin frame rigid with intellectual pride. The trial was a Willow Creek sensation, the courtroom packed daily. The prosecution, led by a determined DA, laid out the damning evidence piece by painstaking piece: the Umbracite found in Silas's lab, the detailed notebooks, the tampered Sparkle Fizz bottles matching those found discarded near the Vance Corbin home months prior, Dr. Finch's expert testimony on the poison's effects and rarity, and finally, Agent Raven Sterling's riveting account of her infiltration and Silas's chilling fascination with poisoning in his Enigma weekend scenario. Silas, refusing court-appointed counsel, chose to represent himself, cross-examining witnesses with cold, precise logic that often veered into condescending lectures. He never denied his ability to make Umbracite or his interest in poisons, framing it as purely theoretical, an intellectual pursuit. He painted the victim's illnesses as tragic coincidence, the evidence circumstantial, his notebooks mere creative writing for his games. His lack of empathy was palpable, horrifying the jury and spectators alike. It took the jury less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. Silas Blackwood received the sentence without visible emotion, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And Dr. Evelyn Thorne? No direct evidence linked her to the planning or execution of the poisoning. She maintained, through her high-priced lawyers, that she was completely unaware of her husband's deadly activities, portraying herself as another victim of his complex deceptions. She filed for divorce immediately following the conviction. Though whispers and suspicions lingered throughout Willow Creek, Evelyn Thorne walked free, retreating behind the shield of her professional reputation, leaving a bitter, unanswered question mark hanging in the air. Justice, in its legal form, had claimed Silas Blackwood. The unmasking was complete, his reign of quiet terror over. But the gavel's fall, while marking an end to the investigation, could do little to silence the echoes of pain or mend the shattered lives left in the wake of his deadly game. The courtroom drama faded, the sharp edges of legal arguments dissolving into the quiet, persistent echo of grief in the hearts of those Silas Blackwood had destroyed. Justice, in its measured, procedural way, had been served. Blackwood, the reclusive genius turned architect of agony, was safely locked away, his intellectual games finally over. But the gavel's fall, while marking an end to the public spectacle, could do little to silence the lingering shadows or mend the shattered lives left trembling in the aftermath of his cold, calculated venom. The unmasking was complete, but the healing? That was a longer, more arduous journey, undertaken far from the courthouse steps, in the quiet, wounded spaces of the Vance Corbin home. For Rhys Corbin, the verdict brought not triumph, but a hollow ache. He was now a widower, navigating the treacherous landscape of single parenthood while wrestling his own profound grief. Elara was everywhere and nowhere, in the scent of lavender lingering on a pillowcase, in the chipped mug she favored for her morning tea, in the sudden, gut-wrenching silences that punctuated the days. He faced the daunting task of raising two traumatized boys alone, his quiet, observant son Sam, now bearing the physical reminder of Blackwood's cruelty in the subtle hesitation of his gait, and Elara's bright spark, Leo, whose boisterous energy was now often dimmed by confusion, nightmares, and questions Rhys couldn't bring himself to answer fully. How do you explain pure, motiveless malice to a child who misses his mother with every fiber of his being? Their journey towards healing was halting, uneven. There were therapist appointments, hushed conversations about feelings too big for small bodies to contain. There were nights Rhys woke to muffled sobs from one bedroom or the other, nights he simply sat between their beds, a silent, helpless guardian against memories that stalked the darkness. Sam struggled with physical therapy, his frustration sometimes boiling over into anger at a body that no longer obeyed him perfectly. Leo, missing the buffer of his mother's unwavering presence, sometimes lashed out, his grief manifesting as defiance. Rhys, juggling his carpentry work, the endless demands of running a household, and the immense weight of his son's pain and his own sorrow, often felt like he was drowning. Yet, amidst the struggle, small seeds of resilience began to sprout. Rhys, clumsy at first, started cooking Elara's recipes, the familiar aromas of bittersweet comfort. Leo and Sam, bound by their shared trauma, forged an even deeper bond, finding solace in whispered jokes and shared glances that spoke volumes. They learned to lean on each other, a fragile tripod against the lingering shadows. There were moments, fleeting but precious, of normalcy, a movie night where laughter, tentative at first, eventually filled the room, a fishing trip where the quiet concentration seemed to offer a temporary truce with their pain. They were rebuilding, painstakingly, brick by emotional brick, on foundations irrevocably shaken but not entirely destroyed. Willow Creek exhaled, but the air was forever changed. The conviction of Silas Blackwood, one of their own, albeit an aloof one, had fractured the town's cozy illusion of safety and predictability. The idyllic facade had cracked, revealing the unsettling truth that darkness could indeed fester behind perfectly manicured lawns and respectable professional titles. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, conversations halting abruptly when Rhys or the boys passed by. There was sympathy, yes, but also a current of fear, of morbid curiosity, a discomforting awareness of the hidden malice that had walked among them. The Blackwood house stood empty, a stark reminder, its drawn blinds like closed eyes guarding unspeakable secrets. Dr. Evelyn Thorne had vanished almost immediately after the trial, selling the house through an out-of-state agent, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions about what she truly knew, or chose not to know. Did she ever suspect the monster she shared her life with? Or was her professional composure simply an impenetrable shield? Willow Creek might never know, and perhaps preferred it that way. The community impact was undeniable, a loss of innocence, a new, wary understanding that the most terrifying monsters didn't always have claws and fangs, but sometimes wore the guise of quiet intelligence and chilling detachment. An age at Raven Sterling, the enigmatic Sarah Dubois who had walked into the lion's den. She disappeared as quietly as she had arrived, her mission accomplished. Detective Harding received a brief, formal commendation mentioning her assistance, but Raven herself offered no goodbyes, sought no accolades. Perhaps she visited the Vance Corbin family once, a quiet, off-the-record conversation offering resources, a gesture of human connection beyond the demands of her job. Or maybe she simply melted back into the shadows from whence she came, leaving Rhys and the boys to navigate their future alone, forever indebted to the woman they barely knew. Justice had caged the architect of their suffering, but true restoration remained elusive. Silas Blackwood's actions were a chilling study in psychopathy disguised as intellectual superiority, a terrifying example of how profound intelligence could curdle into monstrous indifference. Months bled into a year. Autumn returned to Willow Creek, painting the leaves in fiery hues, a stark contrast to the quiet landscape of the Vance Corbin family's ongoing recovery. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Rhys, Leo, and Sam stood together in their backyard. Not far from the now-mended fence bordering the empty Blackwood property, they worked together, planting a young dogwood tree. Sam moved with care, his limp a quiet testament to the poison that still echoed in his nerves. Leo, though still prone to sudden bursts of sadness, focused intently on patting down the soil, his movements mirroring his stepfather's. Reese watched them, a familiar ache tightening his chest. Elara should have been here. But alongside the grief, there was something else, a quiet pride, a fierce love, a stubborn spark of hope. The scars remained, visible and invisible. The shadows of Umbracite might never fully recede. But here, together, under the vast Montana sky, they were finding their way forward. And so, the story of Elara Vance and the monster next door became a somber legend in Willow Creek, a chilling reminder that the most ordinary places can harbor the most extraordinary darkness, and that sometimes, the brightest light shines not in vanquishing the shadows completely, but in the simple, resilient act of planting a tree, and choosing, day by day, to let the sun touch your face again.